The gunshot that shattered the morning stillness also shattered Josephine Evans' world forever. She stood frozen on the dusty main street of Cottonwood Springs, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched her father crumple to the ground, blood blossoming across his white shirt like a macabre flower. Above him stood Sheriff William Blackstone, gun still smoking in his hand. "Papa!" Josephine screamed, rushing forward only to be roughly grabbed by one of the sheriff's deputies. "Stay back, Miss Evans," the deputy warned. "This don't concern you." But it did concern her. It concerned her more than anything ever had or would again. The year was 1878, and Josephine Joe, to those who knew her well, had just turned 21. The daughter of the town's most respected doctor, she had led a relatively sheltered life in the small Arizona Territory town. Her father, Dr. Thomas Evans, had been the only family she had left after her mother's death from tuberculosis 5 years prior. "He was a thief and a liar," Sheriff Blackstone announced to the gathering crowd, holstering his weapon with practiced ease. "Caught him red-handed stealing medicines from his own practice to sell to outlaws." "That's not true," Joe screamed, struggling against the deputy's grip. "My father never stole anything in his life," but her protests fell on deaf ears. The townsfolk murmured among themselves, their faces a mix of shock and growing acceptance of the sheriff's words. After all, Sheriff Blackstone had kept law and order in Cottonwood Springs for nearly a decade. If he said Dr. Evans was a thief, who were they to question it? Only Joe knew the truth. Her father had been compiling evidence against the sheriff for months, evidence of bribes, extortion, and worse. Blackstone had been terrorizing the territory for years under the guise of upholding the law. "Take her to the jail," Blackstone ordered. "She'll need time to cool down before she does something foolish." The deputy dragged Joe away as her father's blood soaked into the dusty earth. Her last glimpse of him was of 2 men carelessly lifting his body onto a cart. She would not even be allowed to give him a proper burial. The cell they threw her into was small and smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. Joe sank onto the hard bench, tears streaming down her face. Her father was gone, murdered in cold blood by the very man sworn to uphold the law. And now she was alone. "You'll be released tomorrow," the deputy said gruffly. "Sheriff figures by then you'll have come to your senses." What the sheriff didn't know was that Joe had no intention of coming to her senses, not if it meant accepting the lie that her father was a criminal. As the cell door clanged shut, she made a silent vow to clear her father's name and bring Blackstone to justice no matter what it took. Joe spent the night alternating between tears of grief and rage. By morning, her eyes were red and swollen, but her resolve had hardened like iron. When the deputy unlocked her cell door, she walked out with her head high, ignoring his warning to stay out of trouble. Her family home, a modest 2-story structure at the edge of town, felt empty and hollow without her father's presence. Joe moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching his possessions, breathing in the lingering scent of his pipe tobacco. In his study, she found the door to his small safe ajar. The documents he had meticulously gathered against Sheriff Blackstone were gone. Joe sank into her father's chair, despair threatening to overwhelm her. Without that evidence, she had nothing to prove her father's innocence or the sheriff's guilt. The sound of boots on the porch startled her. She quickly wiped her tears away as a knock came at the door. Sheriff Blackstone stood on her threshold, his weathered face arranged in an expression of false sympathy. Behind him stood 2 deputies. "Miss Evans," he said, removing his hat. "We've come to offer our condolences and to inform you that, as your father died a criminal, his property is subject to seizure to pay for his crimes." Joe's hands balled into fists at her sides. My father was not a criminal, she said through clenched teeth. Blackstone's sympathetic expression hardened. I'm afraid the evidence says otherwise. You have until tomorrow noon to vacate these premises. You can't do this, Joe protested. This house is mine by right. Not anymore, Blackstone said coldly. Consider yourself lucky I'm not charging you as an accomplice. Your father's reputation in this town has bought you that much leniency. As they turned to leave, Blackstone paused. I'd suggest you accept the situation, Miss Evans. Fighting it will only make things worse for you. After they left, Joe collapsed onto the floor, overwhelmed by grief and helplessness. She had less than 24 hours to leave the only home she'd ever known, with nowhere to go and no means to support herself. The injustice of it burned like a physical pain. That night, she packed what little she could carry: clothes, a few keepsakes, and the small amount of money she kept in her room. As she moved through the house, memories assaulted her at every turn. Her mother teaching her to play the piano in the parlor, her father reading to her by the fireplace, family dinners around the large oak table. By dawn, she was ready to leave, her heart heavy but her determination intact. As the first light of day streaked the sky, Joe slipped out the back door. She couldn't bear to watch as Blackstone and his men took possession of her home. With no clear destination in mind, she headed toward the livery stable. Perhaps Mr. Peterson, who had always been kind to her family, would allow her to take her father's horse. The livery was quiet in the early morning hours. Joe crept inside, relieved to find it empty save for the horses. She quickly located her father's gelding, a sturdy bay named Copper, and began to saddle him. Planning a trip, Miss Evans? A deep voice asked from the shadows. Joe whirled around, her heart racing. A tall figure stepped into a shaft of light streaming through the stable window. He was lean and muscular, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. A cowboy, judging by his attire, worn leather chaps over denim pants, a dusty blue shirt, and a battered hat pushed back on his head. I don't believe that's any of your concern, mister, Joe replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The stranger moved closer, and Joe tensed, ready to flee. But his expression held no threat, only curiosity and something else she couldn't quite identify. Name's Matthew Dawson, he said, touching the brim of his hat, and I'm making it my concern when I see a lady in distress stealing a horse at dawn. I'm not stealing, Joe said defensively. This is my father's horse. Matthew's expression softened. You're Dr. Evans' daughter. I heard what happened. I'm sorry for your loss, madam. Joe swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. Thank you, she managed. But as you can see, I'm fine. I just need to leave town for a while. Matthew studied her for a long moment. Running won't solve anything, Miss Evans. Especially not if you're running from Sheriff Blackstone. Joe's eyes widened. How did you? News travels fast, Matthew said with a shrug. And I've had my own run-ins with the sheriff. He's not a man to cross lightly. He murdered my father in cold blood, Joe said, the words bursting from her like water from a broken dam. He claimed Papa was a thief, but it was a lie. My father was gathering evidence against him, proof of his corruption. Now that evidence is gone and the sheriff is seizing our home. Matthew's expression hardened. That sounds like Blackstone, all right. He's been terrorizing folks across 3 counties for years. He paused, seeming to consider something. Where were you planning to go? Joe looked away. I don't know, she admitted. I just can't stay here. There's a ranch about 20 miles north of here, Matthew said after a moment. Belongs to a friend of mine. You'd be safe there while you figure out your next move. Joe studied him suspiciously. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. A ghost of a smile touched Matthew's lips. Let's just say I've got no love for Blackstone and leave it at that. His expression turned serious again. "But if you're going to challenge him, you need to be smart about it. Running away half-cocked will just get you killed." Joe considered his words. She had been acting on impulse, with no real plan beyond escaping Blackstone's immediate reach. And this stranger, this Matthew Dawson, seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. "This friend of yours," she said slowly. "Would they really take in a stranger?" Matthew nodded. "Marion Cooper is a good woman. She runs the place on her own since her husband passed. She could use an extra pair of hands, and you'd have a roof over your head while you decide what to do next." It was a better option than Joe had on her own, which was essentially nothing. And if Blackstone came looking for her, as she suspected he might, at least she wouldn't be alone. "All right," she said finally. "I'll go to this ranch." Matthew smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his rugged face and sent an unexpected flutter through Joe's chest. "Good decision. Now, let's get your horse ready and hit the trail before the town wakes up properly." As they worked side by side to prepare Copper for the journey, Joe couldn't help stealing glances at her unexpected ally. There was something about Matthew Dawson that intrigued her, a quiet strength, a sense of purpose. Despite her grief and fear, she found herself grateful for his appearance in the stable that morning. "How do you know so much about Sheriff Blackstone?" she asked as they led Copper out of the stable. Matthew's expression darkened. "That's a long story, Miss Evans. One best told on the trail when we're well away from Cottonwood Springs." They departed town as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, taking a little-used trail that wound through the hills. Joe cast one last glance back at the place she'd called home all her life, a single tear sliding down her cheek. She would return someday, she promised herself. Return and set things right. As they rode, Matthew explained that he worked as a ranch hand at the Cooper spread, having drifted into the territory about 6 months earlier. He was circumspect about his past, changing the subject whenever Joe's questions grew too personal. Despite this reticence, Joe found herself warming to him. There was a directness to Matthew that she appreciated, and a kindness beneath his rough exterior. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Cottonwood Springs. They stopped to rest the horses near a small creek, the Arizona sun beating down mercilessly. Joe sank gratefully onto a flat rock in the shade of a cottonwood tree, while Matthew saw to the horses. "You promised to tell me about your history with Sheriff Blackstone," she reminded him when he joined her. Matthew sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "I suppose I did at that." He settled beside her, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "My younger brother, Thomas, ran afoul of Blackstone about 2 years ago. He was just a kid, barely 18, working as a courier for the stage company. Blackstone accused him of stealing from the mail pouches." Joe's stomach tightened, hearing the echo of her own situation in Matthew's words. "Was it true?" Matthew shook his head. "No more than your father was a thief. Thomas had discovered that Blackstone was using the stage line to smuggle contraband. When he threatened to report it, Blackstone framed him." His voice grew tight with suppressed emotion. "Thomas was sentenced to 5 years in Yuma Territorial Prison. He died there 8 months later in a prison riot." "I'm so sorry," Joe said softly, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. "That's horrible." Matthew met her gaze, and the pain in his eyes mirrored her own. "That's why I'm in these parts, Miss Evans. I came looking for evidence against Blackstone, just like your father was doing. I've been watching him, learning his operations, waiting for the right moment to expose him." Joe's heart raced with sudden hope. "Then we have the same goal. We should work together." "It's dangerous," Matthew warned. "Blackstone has deputies and hired guns all over the territory. And he's got powerful friends in high places. I don't care, Joe said firmly. He murdered my father in broad daylight and got away with it. I can't let that stand. Matthew studied her for a long moment, respect dawning in his eyes. You've got grit, Miss Evans, I'll give you that. He nodded slowly. All right, we'll work together, but we do things my way, carefully and smart, no rushing and half-cocked. Joe nodded, a sense of purpose filling the hollow space grief had carved inside her. Agreed, and please call me Joe. A smile tugged at the corner of Matthew's mouth. Joe it is, then. They continued their journey as the day wore on, the landscape growing increasingly rugged. Joe, who had rarely ventured far from town, found herself marveling at the wild beauty of the territory, the sweeping vistas, the dramatic rock formations, the surprising bursts of color from desert wildflowers. By late afternoon, they crested a rise, and Matthew pointed to a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley below. Cooper Ranch, he said. Not the biggest spread in the territory, but Marion runs a tight ship. As they approached, Joe could see that the ranch was indeed modest but well maintained. A large barn stood near a corral where several horses grazed. The main house was a substantial two-story structure with a wide porch. Several smaller outbuildings completed the picture. A woman emerged from the house as they rode into the yard. She was tall and sturdy, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her face, weathered by sun and wind, broke into a smile at the sight of Matthew. Dawson. Wasn't expecting you back so soon, she called, then noticed Joe. And you've brought company, I see. Matthew dismounted and helped Joe down from her horse. Marion Cooper, this is Josephine Evans from Cottonwood Springs. She's in a bit of trouble and needs a safe place to stay for a while. Marion's shrewd eyes assessed Joe quickly. Blackstone, she asked simply. Matthew nodded. Marion's expression hardened. That man has been a plague on this territory for too long. She turned to Joe, her face softening. You're welcome here, Miss Evans. Any enemy of Blackstone's is a friend of mine. Joe felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. I won't be a burden, I promise. I can work. We'll talk about that later, Marion interrupted gently. Right now, you look dead on your feet. Come inside and get some rest. We can sort everything else out tomorrow. Joe followed Marion into the house, casting a grateful glance back at Matthew, who was leading the horses toward the barn. For the first time since her father's murder, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in her fight against Blackstone. And perhaps, just perhaps, justice was still possible. The next few days passed in a blur as Joe settled into life at Cooper Ranch. True to her word, Marion put her to work nothing too strenuous, but enough to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling constantly on her grief. Joe helped with cooking, mending, and tending the kitchen garden, tasks she was familiar with from running her father's household. Matthew, she learned, came and went frequently, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. When he was present, he worked alongside the other ranch hands, mending fences, tending livestock, and performing the myriad tasks necessary to keep the ranch running. Despite the demanding physical labor, he always found time to check on Joe, their conversations growing longer and more personal with each passing day. A week after their arrival at the ranch, Matthew found Joe sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the western sky in vivid hues of orange and pink. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, settling into the chair beside her. Joe nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the evening chill. I never really noticed sunsets in town. There were always buildings in the way, I suppose. That's the thing about the wide open spaces, Matthew said, his voice soft. They make you see things differently. Remind you of what's important. Joe glanced at him, struck by the quiet intensity in his expression as he gazed at the horizon. In the fading light, his profile was strong and compelling. "I've been thinking about what to do next," she said. "About Blackstone, I mean." Matthew turned to face her. "I've been making some inquiries in town. Word is that Blackstone's been boasting about acquiring your father's property. He's planning to sell it to a mining company that wants to build an office there." Anger flared in Joe's chest. "He has no right. That house has been in my family for 2 generations. "No, he doesn't," Matthew agreed. "But he's got the law on his side, or at least the appearance of it." He hesitated, then added, "There's more. I've heard rumors about why your father was killed. Blackstone's been telling people that the doctor was planning to expose some kind of smuggling operation." Joe sat up straighter. "But that's exactly what my father was doing, exposing Blackstone's crimes." "I know," Matthew said. "Blackstone twisted the truth. He's claiming your father was the mastermind behind the smuggling, and that he was eliminating competition when the sheriff caught on." Tears of frustration pricked at Joe's eyes. "No one who knew my father would believe that. He was the most honest man I've ever known." Matthew reached out and covered her hand with his own. The gesture was surprisingly comforting. "I believe you, Joe, and we're going to prove Blackstone is lying, but we need evidence." "The evidence my father collected is gone," Joe said dejectedly. "Blackstone must have taken it when he seized our house." "Maybe not all of it," Matthew said thoughtfully. "Your father was a smart man. Would he have kept everything in one place?" Joe considered the question. "No, I don't think he would have. He was very methodical." Her eyes widened as a memory surfaced. "There's a loose floorboard in his examination room at the clinic. He used to hide special medicines there, things that were valuable or dangerous. He might have hidden documents there too." Excitement flickered in Matthew's eyes. "That's worth checking out." "The clinic is separate from your house," Joe nodded. "It's on the other side of town, near the general store. Papa converted an old storefront years ago." "Has Blackstone seized that too?" "I don't know," Joe admitted. "He only mentioned the house when he came to see me." Matthew stood, pacing the porch as he thought. If Blackstone hasn't taken over the clinic yet, there might still be time to check that hiding spot. "I'll ride into town tomorrow and have a look around." Joe rose to her feet. "I'm coming with you." "It's too dangerous," Matthew protested. "Blackstone and his men are looking for you." "It's my father's clinic," Joe insisted. "I know every inch of it. I know exactly where to look and what we're looking for. Besides, you'll need someone to keep watch while you search." Matthew studied her determined expression and sighed. "You're not going to back down on this, are you?" "No," Joe said firmly. "I'm not." A reluctant smile curved Matthew's lips. "You're as stubborn as a mule, Joe Evans." There was admiration in his voice that sent a warm flutter through Joe's chest. "My father always said it was my finest quality," she replied with a small smile of her own. "All right," Matthew conceded. "But we do this carefully. We'll ride in at dusk when there are fewer people about, but it's not yet suspicious to be walking around town. We'll be in and out as quickly as possible." Joe nodded, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Thank you, Matthew." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. "No need to thank me. We're in this together now." The simple declaration warmed Joe more than she cared to admit. In the midst of loss and upheaval, she had found an unexpected ally in Matthew Dawson, and perhaps something more. A small voice in her heart whispered. They rode out the next afternoon, timing their journey to reach Cottonwood Springs as dusk was settling over the town. Joe had disguised herself as best she could, wearing a plain dress borrowed from Marion and a bonnet pulled low over her face. Matthew had foregone his usual cowboy attire for more nondescript clothing that wouldn't draw attention. They approached town from the east, avoiding the main road. Matthew had scouted a back route that would bring them close to the clinic without passing through the busier parts of town. As the familiar buildings came into view, Jo felt a painful twist in her heart. This had been her home all her life, and now she was sneaking into it like a thief. They left their horses in a copse of trees just outside town and proceeded on foot, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The clinic was dark when they reached it, no sign of occupation or guard. "Looks like Blackstone hasn't claimed this yet," Matthew whispered as they approached the rear door. "Probably figures there's nothing of value here compared to your house." Jo withdrew a key from her pocket. "I always kept a spare," she explained as she unlocked the door. Inside, the clinic was eerily quiet, smelling of antiseptic and herbs. Jo moved confidently through the darkness to her father's examination room at the back, Matthew following close behind. Once there, she closed the curtains tightly before lighting a small lamp. The room was just as she remembered it, an examination table in the center, cabinets of medicines and supplies along one wall, her father's desk in the corner. The familiar setting brought a lump to her throat. "The loose board is over here," she said, moving to a spot near the cabinet. She knelt and felt along the floor until her fingers found the slight depression that marked the hiding place. Matthew knelt beside her, helping her pry up the floorboard. Beneath it was a small cavity containing a metal box. Jo's hands trembled as she lifted it out. "This is it," she breathed, setting the box on the desk and opening it. Inside were several folded documents, along with a leather-bound journal. Jo recognized her father's neat handwriting immediately. She flipped through the journal, her eyes widening. "This is everything," she whispered. "Names, dates, details of Blackstone's operations. He's been smuggling weapons to sell to both sides in land disputes, taking bribes to look the other way during cattle rustling, even ordering killings disguised as lawful arrests." Matthew leaned over her shoulder, scanning the pages. "This is more than enough to bring him down. We need to get this to the federal marshal in Tucson." A floorboard creaked in the outer room. Matthew instantly doused the lamp, plunging them into darkness. "Someone's here," he whispered, drawing his pistol. Jo clutched the journal to her chest, her heart pounding. They pressed themselves against the wall beside the door, listening intently. Footsteps approached slowly, deliberately. The door to the examination room swung open. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, holding a lantern. "I know you're in here," said a familiar voice that made Jo's blood run cold. "Show yourselves." Sheriff Blackstone stepped into the room, his gun drawn. His cold eyes swept the darkness until they found Jo and Matthew in the corner. "Well, well," he drawled. "Miss Evans, I had a feeling you might come back here sooner or later." His gaze shifted to Matthew. "And you brought a friend. How touching." "It's over, Blackstone," Matthew said, his gun trained steadily on the sheriff. "We have proof of everything you've done." Blackstone laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Proof? Who's going to believe the word of a grief-stricken girl and a drifter against that of a respected lawman?" His eyes narrowed as he looked more closely at Matthew. "Wait a minute. I know you. You're the Dawson boy's brother, aren't you? Still sore about that business." "You framed my brother and sent him to die in prison," Matthew said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Just like you murdered Dr. Evans for trying to expose your crimes." "Your brother was a thief," Blackstone sneered. "Just like the good doctor here was running his own little smuggling operation. I was merely upholding the law." "That's a lie," Jo said, stepping forward. "And we can prove it now." Blackstone's eyes fell to the journal in her hands. "Hand that over, girl, and I might let you walk out of here alive." "I don't think so," Matthew said. "Drop your weapon, Blackstone. It's 2 against 1. The sheriff's lips curled in a mocking smile. "Is it?" He raised his voice. "Boys, in here." Joe's heart sank as heavy footsteps sounded in the outer room. Two deputies appeared in the doorway, their guns drawn. "Take their weapons," Blackstone ordered. "And that journal." One of the deputies moved forward cautiously. Matthew kept his gun trained on Blackstone, but with 3 armed men against them, the odds were grim. Joe felt despair washing over her. Suddenly, the front door of the clinic burst open with a splintering crash. Shouts and the sound of multiple footsteps filled the outer room. A commanding voice called out, "Sheriff Blackstone, drop your weapon, you're surrounded." Confusion and alarm crossed Blackstone's face. He hesitated, then swung his gun toward the new threat. A shot rang out and Blackstone staggered backwards, clutching his shoulder. His deputies, seeing their leader wounded, quickly surrendered. A tall man in a dusty coat stepped into the examination room, a badge gleaming on his chest. "Federal Marshal James Harker," he announced. "Sheriff Blackstone, you're under arrest for corruption, extortion, smuggling, and murder." Joe and Matthew exchanged bewildered glances as several armed men entered the room, taking Blackstone and his deputies into custody. The marshal approached them. "Mr. Dawson," he said with a nod to Matthew, "your message reached us just in time, it seems." Understanding dawned on Joe. She turned to Matthew. "You contacted the marshal already?" "When?" Matthew looked somewhat sheepish. "I sent a telegram from the last town I visited before I even met you. I had some evidence of my own against Blackstone, but not enough. I was hoping the marshal would investigate." He gestured to the journal in Joe's hands. "But this is what we really needed. This proves everything." Marshal Harker took the journal and flipped through it quickly. "This is comprehensive," he said, impressed. "Your father was a thorough man, Miss Evans." "He believed in justice," Joe said softly. The marshal nodded respectfully. "And justice he shall have. Blackstone will stand trial for his crimes, including the murder of your father." As Blackstone was led away, he glared at Joe and Matthew with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. Matthew stepped forward, his face hard. "Yes, it is, Blackstone. You're done terrorizing innocent people." He removed his hat and placed it over his heart as he added, "If the law couldn't wear the hat of justice, then justice wears my hat now." In the aftermath of Blackstone's arrest, the town of Cottonwood Springs was in turmoil. Many were shocked by the sheriff's crimes, while others admitted they had long suspected something wasn't right. The territorial governor appointed an interim sheriff, and investigations were launched into all of Blackstone's cases. Joe's family home was returned to her, the false seizure invalidated. The townsfolk, ashamed of how quickly they had believed Blackstone's lies about Dr. Evans, held a proper funeral and memorial service. Joe stood dry-eyed through the ceremony, her grief tempered by the knowledge that her father's murderer would face justice. Matthew remained by her side through it all, a steady, supportive presence. They had grown close during their shared ordeal, their initial alliance deepening into something neither had expected. One evening, a month after Blackstone's arrest, they sat together on the porch of Joe's restored home. The sun was setting over the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. "What will you do now?" Joe asked, breaking a comfortable silence. "With Blackstone headed for prison, your quest for justice is complete." Matthew considered the question. "I've been thinking about that. I've drifted for so long, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "But lately, I've been thinking that maybe it's time to stop drifting." Joe's heart quickened. "Oh, and what's brought about this change of mind?" Matthew reached out and took her hand in his. "I think you know, Joe, these past weeks working together, getting to know you, It's changed something in me, made me want things I thought I'd never want again." Joe squeezed his hand. "Such as a home," he said simply, "a purpose beyond vengeance. Someone to share it all with." Joe felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of a different kind, not of grief, but of hope. "I think I'd like that too," she whispered. Matthew smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. "Marion Cooper offered me a permanent position as her foreman. Said she's getting too old to run the ranch alone and needs someone she can trust to help manage things." "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," Joe said sincerely. "It is," Matthew agreed. "But I told her I needed to discuss it with you first." Joe blinked in surprise. "With me? Why?" Matthew's expression grew serious. "Because where I go, I'm hoping you might consider going too." He took a deep breath. "I know it's soon and maybe I'm being presumptuous, but I've fallen in love with you, Josephine Evans. Your courage, your determination, your compassion, everything about you draws me like a moth to flame." Joy bloomed in Joe's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "It's not presumptuous," she said softly, "and it's not too soon, not when it feels this right." Matthew's face lit up with hope. "Then you feel it too?" In answer, Joe leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was sweet and tender, full of promise. When they parted, she smiled up at him. "I do," she said simply. "I love you, Matthew Dawson." He gathered her into his arms, holding her close as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. In the darkness that followed, they spoke of the future, a future neither had dared to imagine just a few short months ago. A future they would build together, on a foundation of justice, truth, and love. 3 years later, the Cooper Ranch, now the Dawson Ranch, was flourishing. Matthew had proven himself an excellent foreman, and eventually took over ownership when Marion decided to retire to Tucson to live with her sister. Joe had established a small medical practice on the ranch, using the skills she had learned from her father to tend to the health needs of the ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders. They had married in a simple ceremony on the ranch, surrounded by new friends and a few old ones from Cottonwood Springs. Sheriff Blackstone had been convicted of multiple crimes and sentenced to life in Yuma prison, the same prison where Matthew's brother had died. Though the memory of those they had lost would always remain, the pain had softened with time and the building of their new life together. On the 3rd anniversary of her father's death, Joe stood at his grave in the Cottonwood Springs cemetery, Matthew beside her. She placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the headstone. "He would be proud of you," Matthew said gently, "of everything you've accomplished." Joe smiled through her tears. "I think he would have liked you too. You're both stubborn men with strong principles." Matthew laughed softly. "High praise indeed." He placed a protective hand on Joe's slightly rounded belly. "And what do you think he would say about becoming a grandfather?" Joe covered his hand with her own. "He would have been overjoyed." She looked up at Matthew, her heart full of love. "Just as I am, every day, to be building this life with you." As they walked back to their horses, hand in hand, Joe thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. A terrible injustice had set them on a collision course, but from that tragedy had blossomed something beautiful and enduring. Justice had been served, and love had healed wounds that once seemed beyond repair. The future stretched before them, bright with promise, as vast and open as the western skies above.